It was a cold night in New York in the brightly lit City Hall. TV cameras captured a triumphant speech. The mayor, surrounded by allies, raised his crystal goblet, promising prosperity. But behind the scenes, secret documents were circulating, revealing dirty contracts, bribes, and a web of political betrayal. What seemed like a victory was, in fact, the beginning of the collapse of an empire. Behind the lights of the city that never sleeps, a multi-million-dollar scheme grew silently. Fortunes were diverted from public works. Alliances were forged at lavish parties, and secrets were hidden in dark offices. This is the story of how corruption and dark money led a politician from the top to the abyss. Before continuing, subscribe to the channel and like this video, because you'll discover how betrayals and dirty dealings turned promises into ruin, and no one came out unscathed. In the heart of New York, among skyscrapers and promises of progress, an ambitious man emerged, Richard Callahan, a councilman who presented himself as the voice of the people. With fiery speeches and sharp charisma, he won over crowds. He spoke about social justice, but behind the scenes, he was already cultivating dangerous ties with businessmen and lobbyists who saw him as the perfect tool to multiply their fortunes. Richard's early campaigns were funded by lavish parties in secret Manhattan mansions. There, expensive whiskey and Cuban cigars circulated along with envelopes stuffed with promises. To voters, he was a visionary leader. To those familiar with the behind-the-scenes details, it was just the beginning of a career marked by dirty dealings and secrets that would prove costly. Over time, Richard's personal fortune grew inexplicably. While ordinary councilmen were barely able to afford mid-range apartments, he was acquiring Appent House, overlooking Central Park. Imported cars, Swiss watches, and discreet trips to Caribbean islands became routine. The press suspected, but there was no proof. The city, fascinated, called him the new political tycoon. Between dinners with construction businessmen and discreet meetings in five-star hotels, Richard learned that politics was not about serving, but about trading power as currency. Every vote he promised to defend cost him a larger slice of his soul. Bribes disguised as donations fueled his meteoric rise. On one such night during dinner in Brooklyn, Richard met Samuel Whitaker, a real estate mogul willing to finance any campaign in exchange for favors. The pact struck at that table would become the foundation of an empire of corruption, an alliance where each contract signature meant more buried secrets and more future betrayals. With the support of those in power, Richard climbed the ranks as if the city were a chessboard. Every move was calculated. From councilman to council leader, he was seen as the natural candidate for mayor. His smile in front of the cameras hid the anxiety of someone who knew that behind the scenes, a trail of illegal documents followed him. But wealth wasn't enough. Richard wanted to be more than rich. He wanted to be untouchable. And to do that, he needed a safety net of lawyers, police officers, judges, and paid journalists. He bought silence with dollars, built loyalty with champagne parties, and gradually transformed New York into a theater of corruption. The problem is, the larger the network, the greater the risk of someone spilling the beans. An overly loyal advisor, a disgruntled businessman, a scorned lover. The list of potential traitors grew, along with the list of suspicious contracts. Richard believed he had control, but each secret he kept was a bomb waiting for the right moment to explode. While he spoke of progress, New York's poorest neighborhoods saw unfulfilled promises. Unfinished schools, abandoned hospitals, and overpriced projects. People believed bureaucracy was to blame, but the contracts would reveal another truth. Every delay meant millions diverted to offshore accounts. Richard was proud to have created an invisible empire. No one could prove anything, and his public image remained unblemished. But there was one thing he never learned. The city that never sleeps, never forgets. And secrets, no matter how well kept, always find a way to come to light. By then, it was no longer a question of if Richard would fall, but of when. The first rumors were already circulating in the halls of City Hall. Investigative newspapers were beginning to sniff out inconsistencies, and a silent enemy was preparing to pull the first domino. The ambition that had taken him to the top would soon become the weight that would drag him to the abyss. The mayoral election was the pinnacle of Richard Callahan's career. Amid fireworks and deafening applause in Times Square, he presented himself as the man who would bring transparency to politics. The irony was cruel. Behind the scenes, his embezzled fortune had already made him a hidden millionaire, owner of discreet mansions on Long Island and secret investments in shell companies. The city believed it had elected a visionary, but in reality, it handed the keys to City Hall to an architect of corruption. Public works contracts multiplied. Roads, bridges, and hospitals were announced at a frantic pace. However, each project came with secret clauses, calculated overpricing, and dark money that ran in discreet suitcases through the streets of New York. Richard knew he needed to maintain a clean image. So, while the illegal documents were kept in hidden folders, he appeared in photos hugging children at schools or visiting hospitals. The contrast between his public smile and his private secrets was as stark as it was unsettling. The public applauded. His accomplices grew rich. Gala dinners became the stage for their true politics. Within gilded halls, businessmen and councillors toasted champagne while negotiating million-dollar contracts. It was there, amid laughter and empty speeches, that the city's future was auctioned. Each glass raised concealed a price paid in betrayal and purchased silence. One of his most dangerous strategies was to infiltrate allies in all areas of power. Judges who owed favors, police chiefs motivated by generous donations, and journalists bribed to write favorable stories. With this network, Richard believed he had built an untouchable empire, but every empire, no matter how solid it may seem, has invisible cracks. The first crack appeared when a young advisor, Daniel Harris, began to question suspicious transfers. He had access to secret spreadsheets that showed numbers that didn't add up. Richard coldly called him into a private meeting and promised a promotion in exchange for his silence. Daniel accepted immediately, but kept copies of the documents secret. Meanwhile, Richard's fortune grew. Investments in Las Vegas casinos, discreet properties in Miami, and even Swiss bank accounts. The New York mayor was, in effect, a hidden tycoon, but greed knows no bounds. And the more he accumulated, the more risks he took, believing himself invincible. On the streets, people were beginning to question. Delayed construction projects, hospitals without beds, and abandoned schools contrasted with the luxuries Richard displayed on official trips. The press pressed on. But every inconvenient headline was drowned out by expensive lawyers and paid journalists. The secrets remained protected, for now. At a gala evening at the Waldorf Astoria, Richard toasted Samuel Whitaker. The partnership between politician and tycoon had grown so strong that the two were already sharing hidden business dealings in tax havens. But what Richard didn't realize was that Samuel wasn't loyal. He was already preparing his own move, amassing evidence that could destroy the mayor at the right moment. While Richard believed he had control over everything, the silent betrayals multiplied. Some council members began negotiating advantages with rival businessmen. Secretaries listened in on compromising phone calls and kept recordings. And even police officers paid by Richard whispered about the secret contracts. Every poorly hidden secret was a weapon waiting to be used. The collapse began to take shape when an investigative reporter, Michael Ross, received an anonymous envelope. Inside were copies of contracts signed by the mayor and records of transfers to shell companies. Michael knew he had something explosive in his hands. But publishing without additional evidence would be journalistic suicide. He decided to wait. Richard, however, sensed danger in the air. He began beefing up his personal security, hiring private security guards to watch over his Long Island mansion. But paranoia couldn't erase the feeling that secrets were slipping through his fingers. His fortune seemed increasingly difficult to protect. In private meetings, allies began to question his leadership. Some suggested scaling back illegal contracts. Others urged Richard to back down. He responded firmly, "If we stop now, we're dead. The only way out is forward." That sentence would mark the beginning of his downfall. While pretending to be an exemplary mayor, Richard indulged in increasingly extravagant luxuries. He collected rare works of art, kept mistresses in hidden apartments, and planned secret parties where politicians and businessmen indulged in unspeakable excesses. Each night of pleasure was paid for with more betrayal and secrets. Newspapers began publishing cryptic columns about suspicious contracts and political bribes. Richard smiled in front of the cameras and called it all fake news. But in the silence of his office, he broke glasses in rage. The empire was beginning to crack, and he knew he couldn't contain all the leaks at once. One day, upon opening the door to his mansion, Richard found a mysterious folder left in the hallway. Inside were photos of his secret parties and copies of signed contracts. No sender's signature. It was a clear warning. Someone on the inside was ready to take him down. But who? At each new meeting, the mayor looked around the table suspiciously. Was it the businessmen, the council members, or Samuel himself, his most powerful ally? Betrayal could come from any side. And he discovered, too late, that loyalty is inescapable when fortune and secrets are the only glue holding an empire together. As the lights of New York shone, the fall had already begun. And as with every political collapse, the first explosion would come not from the streets, but from the silent corridors where secrets become sharp knives. Richard's empire still seemed solid, but inside it was already rotten. One rainy afternoon in New York, Richard received an unmarked manila envelope in his office. The secretary's trembling hands placed the envelope on the mahogany desk. Upon opening it, Richard saw copies of contracts, doctored invoices, and receipts bearing his signature. This wasn't hearsay. It was proof. His heart raced. The fortune he had spent years amassing was recorded in detail. The dirty money that had flowed through the hands of businessmen and politicians was now turned into cold paper, ready to destroy his empire. Richard knew someone very close to him had betrayed him. But who would have the courage? His first reaction was anger. He threw the envelope against the wall and yelled at his aides. But in the silence of the office, he realized that the folder wasn't just a threat. It was a sentence. The secrets he kept under control were becoming ammunition in the hands of someone intent on destroying him. As Richard struggled to contain his fear, newspapers began receiving anonymous tips. Reporters began knocking on his mansion's door, inquiring about overpriced construction and hastily signed contracts. The public narrative was still manageable, but the rumors could no longer be silenced with champagne and fake smiles. In an urgent meeting with Samuel Whitaker, Richard demanded answers. The tycoon reassured him that it was just a bluff, an attempt at blackmail. But in Samuel's cold eyes there was something strange, almost triumphant. Richard sensed, for the first time, that perhaps the greatest traitor was sitting right in front of him. In the halls of City Hall, allies began to back away. Councillors who had once vied for his support now avoided his meetings. Phone calls were ignored. Invitations to lavish dinners returned unanswered. Richard was still the city's most powerful mayor, but he was now surrounded by a deafening silence. The mysterious dossier continued to grow. Every week, new documents surfaced in newspapers and TV shows, photos of secret parties, bank statements from accounts in tax havens, and even audio recordings of dinners. Each revelation eroded his image, painting a portrait of a politician who had traded votes for fortune. Daniel Harris, the quiet aide who had kept copies of spreadsheets, began to be seen in discreet meetings with journalists. Richard realized too late the seemingly loyal young man had become the key to his downfall, and the most painful part was that Richard himself had trained him to handle the secrets that were now destroying him. The headlines became relentless. Millionaire mayor accused of overbilling, contract secrets revealed, hidden fortune exposed in explosive dossier. The streets of New York, once illuminated by Richard's image as a hero, now saw him as a villain. People began protesting in front of City Hall. Inside the house, the situation was no better. His wife, Claire, demanded answers. His children confronted him, asking if it was all true. Richard tried to deny it, but the newspapers in his hands spoke louder. The home, once a luxurious retreat, became a scene of silence and distrust. With each new scandal, Richard sought solace in secret parties. But not even the most expensive whiskey could silence the voices demanding justice. His fortune seemed worthless, incapable of buying back the town's trust. Every laugh in the ballrooms sounded like an echo of betrayal. The businessmen who had previously handed him stuffed envelopes now disappeared. No one wanted to be associated with the mayor, who had become a symbol of corruption. Samuel, colder than ever, began to appear alongside other emerging politicians. The man who had seemed like his ally was ready to take the throne he had left. One night, Richard received an anonymous phone call. A calm, menacing male voice said simply, "Everything you've built will be exposed. Your fortune won't save you." The phone fell from his hand. He knew it wasn't an empty threat. It was a final sentence. The FBI began investigating. Secret reports circulated among federal prosecutors and investigators. Suspicious transfers, inflated contracts, properties acquired in the name of front men. The network of corruption, previously invisible, began to take shape on official pages. The empire was crumbling before their eyes. Richard tried to react. He gathered allies for an emergency dinner in Manhattan, but the room was half empty. Those who attended spoke little, looked a lot, and left quickly. The political betrayal was clear. The mayor no longer had an army. All that remained was the illusion of power in a palace surrounded by enemies. The streets were bustling. Protests erupted in front of City Hall. Posters with slogans like "Traitor of the People" and "Stolen Fortune, Forgotten City" dominated the squares. The population, previously deceived by the speeches, now demanded answers. Richard looked out the window and saw the abyss between his gilded mansion and the collapsing city. The climax came when primetime television aired a bombshell report. Images of signed contracts, million-dollar accounts in tax havens, and testimonies from businessmen appeared. Journalist Michael Ross, with a firm gaze, said, "The mayor of New York built his fortune on corruption, secrets, and political betrayal." Richard tried to sue the TV station. His lawyers stepped in, but the tide was too strong. The dossier was now in the hands of federal authorities. It was no longer a matter of public image, but of survival. The mayor was no longer just a suspect politician. He was a potential defendant. The man who believed himself untouchable began to walk the streets in fear. He looked over his shoulder, avoided crowds, and hid behind security guards. His life of luxury now felt like a prison. Every shadow hid an enemy. Every silence carried a secret, and every look was a reminder that his downfall was near. Samuel finally delivered the final blow. At a private dinner, he revealed to Richard that he was cooperating with the authorities. He showed him documents he had signed, already submitted to the FBI. "Dirty business always ends badly," he said coldly. Richard felt his world spin. The betrayal was complete, and now his fortune was worthless. Richard believed he had seen the worst, But the conspiracy was just beginning. While he slept in his Manhattan mansion, secret meetings were taking place in discreet hotels around the city. Allies who had sworn loyalty now plotted his destruction, each willing to trade secrets for immunity. In the halls of City Hall, the mood changed. Officials whispered, council members distanced themselves, and aides disappeared without explanation. Richard felt the isolation growing like an invisible poison. The same man who had built an empire of corruption now became a prisoner of the silence he had cultivated. Newspapers began publishing daily columns about the millionaire mayor. The nickname stuck like a scar. Headlines spoke of inflated contracts, bribes, and obscene parties. What had previously been mere rumor became a national narrative. Richard found himself transformed into a villain in the city he had sworn to protect. The conspiracy wasn't just political. Formerly allied businessmen began financing new candidates, preparing for the succession. They knew Richard's empire was doomed. Each check supporting a new political figure was another brick removed from the wall that protected him. Claire, his wife, became the shadow of the house. She had discovered messages exchanged with lovers and secret trips paid for with public funds. Marital betrayal was compounded by political betrayal. The fortune that supported his luxuries was now a source of shame. Claire no longer defended him. She watched him with cold eyes. Richard tried to manipulate the narrative. He created emergency programs for poor neighborhoods, announced school renovations, and made million-dollar donations. But the city no longer believed him. Every promise seemed like a ruse to hide dark secrets. The streets echoed with chants of resignation and arrest now. Inside City Hall, a group of council members began talks with federal prosecutors. They offered information in exchange for plea bargains. They offered contracts, payment lists, and even dinner recordings. Each piece of information was a stab in the mayor's back. The betrayal was now institutionalized. Daniel Harris, the young aide, handed the FBI a flash drive. On it were complete spreadsheets of financial transactions. More than $50 million had been embezzled through bogus contracts. This was the bombshell everyone had been waiting for. And upon discovering it, Richard knew he could no longer silence the young man without attracting fatal suspicion. The protests grew. Crowds crowded the front of City Hall with torches, signs, and chants. "Stolen fortune, betrayed city," they chanted in unison. Richard watched from the high windows, palms sweaty, feeling like a king trapped in his gilded castle. Power was slipping from his grasp. Meanwhile, Samuel Whitaker was solidifying his position. He appeared in interviews defending morality in politics, ironically using Richard's secrets as a shield. The town began to see him as the natural successor, unaware that the tycoon was complicit in the very schemes he exposed. In secret meetings, prosecutors devised strategies to arrest the mayor. Wiretaps were authorized, and bank account traces were initiated. Richard's every call was recorded. Every encounter was observed. The man who had believed himself invisible now lived under the watchful eye of the state. The lavish parties became traps. At a dinner party on Long Island, hidden cameras captured businessmen handing over suitcases of cash. The footage was leaked to the press, confirming the dirty dealings. The footage went viral within hours, transforming Richard into a byword for national corruption. The next morning he couldn't sleep. The ticking of the clock sounded like a sentence. He walked the halls of the mansion, surrounded by expensive works of art, but unable to find peace. His fortune had become a prison, every painting and every chandelier a reminder of the price of dark money. His psychological breakdown deepened. Richard began to distrust even his personal security guards. He avoided windows, fearing snipers. He stored documents in makeshift safes, as if he could still safeguard secrets already exposed. Paranoia gnawed at him, and every shadow seemed like a traitor poised to strike. The FBI intensified its operation. Discreet cars began following him through the streets of New York. Helicopters circled discreetly over his mansion. The city was buzzing. It was no longer just a suspicion. It was only a matter of time before the mayor was handcuffed on camera. The spectacle was being prepared. Meanwhile, the family was falling apart. Claire took her children out of town, claiming safety. In reality, she was fleeing public embarrassment. Longtime friends avoided her contact. Richard found himself alone, surrounded by the ghosts of secrets he had created. At City Hall, his seat no longer carried any weight. Projects were approved without consulting him. Council members ignored his orders. The most powerful man in the city was now nothing more than a symbol of decay. And New York, which never sleeps, watched in real time the downfall of its ruler. Samuel, in a calculated move, began funding parallel investigations. He wanted to ensure Richard's downfall, but in a public and exemplary fashion. The conspiracy was now not just about political destruction, but about humiliation. The tycoon wanted to see him fall in public. That night, Richard looked out his penthouse window and saw the city lit up. New York shone as always, oblivious to the plight of the man who ruled it. He realized the irony. He had built his fortune by stealing from the city, but in the end, it would be the city itself that would devour him. Paranoia led him to make mistakes. He tried to transfer millions into secret accounts, but he was already being monitored. Every computer click, every call to lawyers was tracked. By trying to save his fortune, he only accelerated the empire's collapse. The FBI obtained search warrants. City Hall offices were raided in the early hours of the morning. Documents were confiscated, computers stolen. Journalists broadcast live, headlines screamed in red. The empire was being dismantled before the eyes of the world. Richard tried to negotiate. He offered to sacrifice allies in exchange for immunity, but it was too late. Prosecutors had too much evidence, and worse, his accomplices were now cooperating. Each testimony added a nail to the millionaire mayor's political coffin. Richard's secrets were no longer secrets. They became a spectacle. TV shows replayed lavish parties, hidden recordings, and dinner recordings. His public image as a charismatic man dissolved in a sea of betrayals. The people, once deceived, now took pleasure in watching him fall. In a final desperate move, Richard tried to publicly blame Samuel, but the tycoon had already protected his image. The accusation sounded desperate and only reinforced the narrative that the mayor was lost. The conspiracy had won. Richard now walked alone through deserted corridors. His shadow, projected on the walls, seemed larger than he was. The empire of fortune and secrets had collapsed, and the city, indifferent, remained vibrant. New York, the city that never sleeps, had just witnessed yet another tycoon's downfall. The conspiracy had reached its peak. The mayor wasn't yet in prison, but he was no longer governing. It was only a matter of time. And like every political tragedy, the end would come in grand style, exposed before the cameras, betrayed by friends, and crushed by the fortune he once believed he controlled. On the most anticipated night of the year, Richard hosted a gala dinner in Manhattan. The room was illuminated by golden chandeliers, tables decorated with crystal glasses and French wine. He believed this event would prove his strength, but in reality, it would be the stage for his ultimate downfall. The guests arrived in formal attire, business people, politicians, journalists and judges. Everyone was smiling, but their eyes hid secrets. Some had already struck deals with prosecutors. Others were there simply to witness the spectacle of the downfall. Richard walked through the ballroom, unaware of the scale of the betrayal. The opening toast echoed throughout the hall. Richard raised his glass and spoke of prosperity and a bright future for New York. But as he smiled, journalists discreetly received messages on their cell phones. A comprehensive dossier containing irrefutable evidence had just been released to the entire national press. Suddenly, the dinner descended into chaos. Cell phones vibrated at every table. Headlines began to pop up in real time. New York mayor implicated in billion-dollar corruption. Hidden fortune discovered in tax havens. Richard's face was plastered across the screens as a symbol of political decay. Samuel Whitaker seized the moment. He calmly stood up, approached some businessman, and whispered that Richard's era was over. His cold demeanor revealed the final blow. The tycoon had planned every detail. The betrayal was complete before the mayor's astonished eyes. Richard noticed the movement, the quiet laughter, the scornful glances, the heavy silence. He understood. There was no one left. Everyone had traded their loyalty for the promise of survival. The fortune he believed would buy loyalty now turned to dust before the brightly lit room. As he tried to regain control, journalists swarmed the scene. Cameras were raised, flashbulbs flashed, sharp questions pierced the air. "Mayor Callahan, did you embezzle billions? Who financed your Long Island mansions? Are you resigning today?" The gilded dinner was turning into a public tribunal. Claire, seated at the table, silently stood up and left the room. The gesture was interpreted as condemnation. The First Lady was abandoning her husband in front of the cameras. Richard, for the first time, couldn't respond. His silence was worth more than any confession. At the height of the confusion, federal prosecutors arrived accompanied by FBI agents. The room came to a standstill. Cameras captured the moment the officials announced that Richard was being formally investigated for corruption, bribery, and money laundering. Shock spread like wildfire. Richard tried to react, but his voice faltered. He said he was a victim of political persecution, that it was all a conspiracy. But the evidence shown in real time on TV left no doubt. Bank statements, fake contracts, and even audio recordings of secret meetings appeared on the giant screen in the room. The mayor, once a hidden tycoon, stood naked before the city. His secrets had been exposed, his fortune turned into evidence against him. The man who had dominated New York was now a spectacle. The gala dinner had become a stage for historic humiliation. As he was surrounded by agents, Richard glanced at Samuel. The magnate smiled discreetly, raising his glass as if toasting victory. It was in that moment that Richard understood. Betrayal came not only from the weak, but especially from those who coldly plot the fate of empires. The guests began to leave. Some laughed, others murmured. Journalists broadcast live, describing every detail. The entire city watched. New York, which never sleeps, stood still to witness the downfall of a man who had turned politics into a dirty business. The collapse was irreversible. Richard was led out of the room amidst incessant flashes of light. His expensive suit seemed ill-fitting, his expression etched with fear. Every step was accompanied by shouts, "Thief! Traitor! Stolen fortune!" The powerful man now walked like a defendant, surrounded by eyes hungry for justice. Crowds waited in the streets. When Richard emerged, he was met with boos and insults. Some threw newspapers with his photo on the cover. Others held up signs demanding his immediate arrest. The spectacle was not only political, but also social. The city was out for blood. Inside the FBI car, Richard finally broke the silence. He murmured that he could still reverse everything, that he knew too many secrets. But the agents remained impassive. They knew the man no longer had any power. His secrets had been replaced by his own mind. As the car rolled down Fifth Avenue, TV cameras broadcast every second. It was like watching a king fall. The man who believed he had conquered eternity now became a prisoner of his own ambition. The narrative loop began to form, the top and the bottom united by the same stage. Samuel, in his penthouse, watched on television. He toasted with expensive whiskey as Richard was taken away as a criminal. For him, it was no surprise. Everything had been planned. The tycoon now occupied the mayor's vacancy, proving that in politics there are no friends, only interests. The gala dinner became an eternal symbol. Images from that night traveled the world, splashed across newspapers and cell phone screens. Richard Callahan's downfall wasn't just a local affair. It demonstrated how fortune, secrets, and betrayal always converged toward the same fate: ruin. The first hours after dinner were devastating. While Richard was being questioned, TV stations broadcast real-time images. His face appeared alongside embezzled billions of dollars. The fortune that had made him famous now became proof of corruption, displayed like a trophy before the entire nation. City Hall was surrounded by federal agents. Documents were seized, computers sealed, and political coffers opened. Officials left carrying boxes under the watchful eye of the press. The empire of secrets, built on years of dirty dealings, crumbled in a matter of days. Thousands protested outside City Hall. Signs read, "Political betrayal will never be forgotten," and "A fortune stolen is a life destroyed." Shouts echoed through the streets of New York. The city Richard had sworn to protect demanded his head. This was no longer just justice, it was collective revenge. The next day's newspapers plastered his downfall in giant letters. The corrupt mayor's lost fortune. From luxury to ruin, the betrayal revealed on national television. Each headline was a shovelful of dirt on Richard Callahan's political grave. The press no longer feared him. It devoured him. Claire officially separated just hours after the scandal broke. Lawyers released a statement claiming she had no knowledge of her husband's dirty dealings. Gossip columns celebrated her decision as a gesture of dignity. Richard had not only lost his city, but also his family. Their children, once raised in luxury, were removed from the media spotlight. Reporters hounded them at school, trying to extract statements. The Callahan name, synonymous with prestige, was now a curse. The fortune that supported them had become a public disgrace, splashed across every newspaper. Official investigations moved forward at record speed. Prosecutors gathered over 100 pieces of documentary evidence, statements, contracts, audio recordings, and testimonies. The FBI uncovered transfers to Caribbean islands and properties held under shell companies. Each discovery was another brick torn from the mayor's castle. Businessmen who had grown rich alongside Richard rushed to turn state's evidence. In exchange for immunity, they handed over recordings of dinners, photos of suitcases of cash, and details of illegal contracts. The betrayal completed the cycle. Each accomplice saved their own skin by handing over a piece of the empire. In churches, pastors cited his case as an example of the destruction caused by greed. Sermons spoke of how dangerous ambition can corrupt even the most powerful. The moral was spread. Fortunes gained in secret and corruption never survive. It was the lesson the city absorbed. TV shows explored every detail. Stage dramas, interviews with former employees, experts debating his downfall. Richard became a national spectacle, a perfect plot of betrayal, lost fortune, and political collapse. His story fueled headlines and sold ratings like no other scandal. The political funeral was broadcast live. There was no coffin, but there was a symbolic death. The mayor, who had once been called the Hope of New York, was now remembered as the traitor who sold the city for dollars. His legacy was buried under layers of shame and corruption. At City Hall, an emergency committee took control. Contracts were reviewed, overpriced projects suspended, and budgets frozen. The city needed a cleansing, not just physical, but also moral. Every decision made was accompanied by a repudiation of Richard's name, erasing his presence from official history. Meanwhile, inside his temporary cell, Richard watched the news on television. Every word was a stab in the back. The fortune he believed would last forever was now being discussed as a crime. The man who dreamed of being remembered as a visionary leader was being passed down to posterity as an example of corruption. The international media also took notice. Headlines in London, Paris, and Tokyo cited the scandal. Fall of political tycoon in New York. The case was no longer confined to the United States and had become global, proving that political secrets can leak anywhere in the world. Samuel Whitaker cemented his image as a savior. He appeared in interviews defending ethics and transparency. His cynicism was evident, but the public applauded him. While Richard sank, Samuel built a new empire on his ruins, demonstrating that betrayal is the most valuable currency in politics. Social media exploded. Memes, videos, and hashtags transformed the scandal into popular culture. Young people laughed at photos of Richard in handcuffs, while others shared old speeches contrasted with evidence of corruption. The fall became entertainment. The empire, a national joke. Investors began abandoning projects linked to the Callahan name. Companies broke contracts, banks froze accounts. The seemingly infinite fortune was crumbling under social and financial pressure. The millionaire politician now became a moral beggar, incapable of buying even silence. Finally, the city breathed a sigh of relief. New York saw in its downfall a collective catharsis. Richard Callahan had been destroyed not only by conspiracy, but by his own ambition. The dirty fortune he had built became a heavy chain, dragging him down. And the people, finally, felt that justice had begun. At the maximum security prison, Richard wasn't given a regular cell. The guards placed him in a clean, isolated room with a made bed and a wooden desk. Some called it the Golden Cell, but for him, it was nothing more than a cage with no visible bars, filled with silence and regret. The white walls suffocated him more than any chain. He spent hours staring at the ceiling, remembering the golden chandeliers of his mansion. The difference was cruel. Before, the shine reflected power. Now it reflected ruin. Luxury had become psychological torture. The guards treated him with distant respect. They knew he had been one of the most powerful men in New York, but they also knew he was now nothing more than a traitor. The silence between them was worse than insults. It revealed that even strangers saw him as an example of decadence. Richard began hearing voices at night. He swore he heard the city's protests echoing off the walls of his cell. Thief, stolen fortune, political treason. Each imagined scream was a reminder that his downfall had not only been public, but eternal. The city haunted him even in his dreams. He tried to write on sheets of paper, recording memories, justifications, excuses. But with each sentence, he realized he was lying to himself. His secrets were exposed, his fortune lost, his betrayal recorded in official documents. Nothing he wrote could erase the past. The lawyers visited him less and less each week. There was no longer any way to negotiate, no way to escape. Richard realized he was alone. The men who had once toasted him at lavish dinners now smiled beside Samuel Whitaker. The ally he had once called brother had become his silent executioner. The golden cell began to become his greatest punishment. There were no rusty bars or dirt, but there was emptiness. The silence was absolute. For a man accustomed to applause, celebrations, and whispered secrets, the sound of nothingness was more deadly than any sentence. Richard began talking to himself. He repeated names, recalled contracts, cursed ghosts. Paranoia took over. He believed microphones were hidden in the walls, that prosecutors were spying on him even from within. His empire of power had become a mental prison with no way out. In solitude, he remembered the phrase he had repeated so often, "If we stop now, we are dead." Now he understood the weight of those words. The ambition that had propelled him upward had also pushed him toward the abyss. He stopped and died, not physically, but politically, socially, spiritually. The letters he received were few and cold. None came from his family. only formal messages from lawyers and demands from creditors. The silence from Claire and her children was the most painful stab. To them, he was nothing more than a worthless ghost, the man who ruined his own name. Thus, Richard Callahan spent his days in a gilded prison, surrounded by clean walls but corroded within. The lost fortune, the exposed secrets, and the consummated betrayal had turned him into a shadow. The millionaire who believed himself to be eternal was now just a living memory that corruption always takes its toll. In that same City Hall room, where years before he had raised the crystal goblet promising prosperity, Richard now appeared in archival footage. The contrast was stark. The smiling man of the past had become an exposed criminal. The same scenario, but now a symbol of lies and betrayal. TV cameras replayed the opening scene of his victory, intertwined with the headlines of his downfall. The cycle was complete. The mayor who presented himself as hope ended up as a farce. The city that never sleeps witnessed the birth and destruction of a political empire on the same stage. Richard, isolated, watched on television from the gilded prison. He saw his own face on the screens, the broken promises, the protests, the lost fortune. The silence of the cell echoed louder than any crowd. He understood too late that he had created his own downfall. In the collective memory, Richard ceased to be a man and became a symbol. His name now represented corruption, secrets, and betrayal. New York would move forward, vibrant, but always remembering that fortunes built on dark money crumble. The people never forget. The loop closed. From luxurious toast to the silence of prison, from the top to the abyss, from fortune to emptiness. Richard Callahan's story proved the eternal moral. Blind ambition turns empires to dust. And when dirty money meets dangerous ambition, the price will always be paid. Richard Callahan's downfall was not just the story of one man, but a reflection of a universal truth. When fortune is built on corruption, secrets, and betrayal, it becomes a gilded prison. The glitter may be captivating, but beneath it lies a void, ready to swallow everything. New York City moved on. New leaders emerged, new contracts were signed, but the Callahan name remained etched like a wound. A reminder that political greed destroys not only empires, but also families, reputations, and entire dreams. This story shows us that true fortune isn't measured in hidden figures or dirty dealings, but in the trust we leave as a legacy. Richard chose blind ambition and paid the price. The moral is clear. Every secret comes to light, and every betrayal has a day of reckoning. What about you? Have you noticed how power can corrupt or how greed can turn allies into enemies? Reflect on what's truly worthwhile. Because no matter how high you climb, if the foundations are built on corruption, the fall will be inevitable and devastating. If this story impacted you, don't let it pass you by. Like this video and follow our page right now. Here we reveal the behind-the-scenes details of hidden fortunes, the secrets behind greed, and the betrayals that change destinies. Because knowing these stories is the best way to never repeat them.